Into Flutter. I'm going to tell you two stories. The first one's a horror story. The second one's actually related to the Flutter talk. First one, the horror story, is I installed the beta of Mojave. It's ruined my Mac, and I had to do a whole factory restore last night before the talk. But anyways, I got everything backed up. Everything's good to go. So, as developer, that's a horror story. Things didn't work. My battery was dying. I think what happened was Little Snitch, Chrome, all these things were taking up so much battery life that my Mac, which usually lasts like 5 hours, was lasting like 30 minutes after. So I was like, okay, well, screw that.
Was there a Mac update for Mojave?
No, it's a beta. So that's why. You don't install betas, bleeding edge. Yeah. It's a bleeding edge, so I got cut. I finally understand what that term means now. Okay, so welcome to this talk, Introduction to Flutter. Has anyone used Flutter here before? Great. People will be bored. Other than these people, everyone else will have a good time. No, I'm joking. Everyone's going to have a good time, hopefully. I'll make it interesting. So before we start, who am I? I'm a Google developer expert, which just means that I just go to conferences, talk about Google products, nothing cool. I'm also a senior engineer at Zoom.ai. We're an AI company in Toronto. We build an automated assistant for large enterprises. Nothing to do with Flutter. We're all like machine learning, NLP, all that stuff. Flutter is just like something I do in my spare time. I have a few businesses I've written apps in Flutter with, and I've been doing Dart for a really long time. So that's how I got involved with this space. So I'm going to start off with the actual story. And where did Flutter come from? So I'm going to set the stage. It's October. I'm in Munich. We're having a good time. We're going by. Anyone been to Munich here? Yeah, right? So I'm hanging out in Munich. Great time. Went to like this big beer house, got drunk, and then the next day was the Dart conference. And so we're at the Dart conference, and we're listening to all these talks. I think I did present there also. I presented on Angular to Dart. Anyways, listening to this talk, and at the end of the day, one of the Chrome's product manager comes on board. And he gets to the podium, and he starts talking about this secret thing that they're working on called Sky. And he says, Sky is this new cross-platform tool. And he says that, I roll my eyes. I'm like, oh, not Cordova again, right? Or like, all sorts of web view engines, all that stuff. But he starts showing demos. And the demos are pretty cool. I think it was like a calculator and like some box spinning around, but it was running Dart code on iOS and Android, and it was pretty cool. And what he said was, it's actually native code. It's not using some sort of web view trick or anything. And there was a lot of misconception from that day till probably till Google came out and made it very clear. The reasoning is because in his talk, he talks about how the Chrome team took the actual rendering engine of Chrome, which is WebKit, Blink, or whatever, tore down all the DOM, got rid of all that garbage, and just kept the Skia rendering engine, right? So that's the actual thing that draws out the elements and stuff that, as developers, you rarely ever interact with, if at all. And so they took that, and that's what they used to render Flutter View. So we're jumping ahead. So anyways, he shows this off, and I'm wowed, and I'm like, wow, great. And again, it's bleeding edge, so I download the alpha, and it runs a bit, and it's kind of cool. I can write something up, and it runs natively on iOS and runs natively on Android. Now, this is a big thing for me. Anyone here mobile developers? I think everyone should be. Yeah, okay. And iOS, how many iOS developers? And how many Android? Great. So Android developers, like me, hate doing iOS work, right? Like, look at Objective-C. I was like, I don't understand these square brackets. And then you look at Swift, and you're like, whatever, that's too much. I don't want to learn that now. I already have an Android app to deal with. And at least my personal problem is I write an Android app. It does fairly well on the Play Store. But I have a full-time job. I have other stuff to do. I don't want to rewrite the entire app again on iOS. Then when I rewrite it, there's a bug comes up. I got to fix that bug on iOS. Another bug pops up on Android, and I'm just forever playing this bug squashing game. And the worst thing is when I have to do a new feature, I got to rewrite that feature twice, right? So that's the barrier to entry for iOS for me. And the same applies. I'm not bashing iOS. I love iOS. If you go to iOS developers, the same problem, right? As an iOS developer, they don't want to do Android development because of the fact that they're going to be doing two people's jobs. Now, unless you're, Angry Birds or Flappy Bird or something and making tons of money, you're not going to hire a developer, especially if it's a side project. So forget that. And if you're managing a big team, you're not going to double your team size just for iOS development and then manage all that backlog and icebox that will never get filled, all that stuff. So that's the story behind Flutter. And internally, the reason why Flutter exists is Google has the same problem. It's hard to believe Google with unlimited money, who can do whatever the hell they want, has this problem. They're building, internally, they have an app called Green Tea or something. I don't know if it's secret, but whatever, everyone knows now. So what they use it for, it's a CRM app, and the app is basically this, imagine all of Google's clients, all the salespeople have this app, and they can look at the app and they could be like, okay, this person migrated to Kubernetes, so we should upsell him on XYZ. And so the engineers, the salespersons had an iOS app, an Android app. And so whenever new features came out, the developer team had to actually build it twice. And this was killing a lot of time for Google. So internally, Google built this large matrix of, all right, let's look at competitors. Let's look at, even internally, let's look at Google products we have right now. They had GWT, they had progressive web apps. What can we do to make this better? And so in this large matrix, they wrote down all the languages that they have internally, every single obscure language. I think that's how Google works. Whatever, and there was Dart. And then they wrote down all sorts of technologies that they can use. And someone somewhere was thinking about Dart on mobile. And what happened was the Chrome team saw this and they said, you know what, this seems interesting. Let's try to figure out what we can do here. And so they went in, they took the rendering engine, and they started to port the Dart code over to the rendering engine such that the Dart code actually draws all these components. Now, Dart we'll get into. Anyone actually know Dart here? Yeah. I think everyone's hand should go up because Dart is such a boring, simple language that everyone knows it. Like if you know JavaScript, if you know any single normal programming language, I'm not talking about like Objective-C, but like a normal language, everyone knows it, right? It's just a simple, plain language with a lot of really cool things, but to get started, it's extremely simple. And so Dart's not the barrier to entry here. It's just understanding Flutter, which is what this talks about. And so Flutter's main goal is to be the 60 frames per second native on Android and iOS. And they take the 60 frames per second very, very seriously. Once I was in San Francisco, or Mountain View, and I went to their office, and they had these big charts running in the back. And these charts were actually UI frame tests running. So whenever they pushed a commit, they actually tested all their UI code to make sure that it's running 60 frames per second. And once something didn't, it regressed. The engineer got fired. I don't know. No, I'm just joking. And it's not a web view, right? Saying that it is using a part of the small little part or a large part of Chrome's rendering engine doesn't mean it's a web view. It does not use HTML. It does not use crazy CSS. None of that, right? This is nothing to do web. It's just this rendering engine. It's analogous to, it's actually literally analogous to Unity, right? So if you write a game in Unity, anyone done Unity game development? Right. You write some code in Unity, it will run natively on XYZ. And so that's what Flutter is. And Flutter is built on 3 principles: fast, beautiful, and natural. And that fast really comes from this idea that at 60 frames per second, everything is really smooth and working as expected. Beautiful, and this is subjective, I guess, but the beautiful part comes from the idea that they've implemented material design to spec. The material design team sits beside the Flutter team, and they really make sure that every single component that Flutter has is up to spec. It looks like a material design component. That's not to say that your apps will look all the same. Material design doesn't necessarily mean that. It means that you can customize it, but all the UX principles are built into these components. And lastly, natural. And this is the most important part of Flutter, at least in my opinion. The idea that anyone who's done web view development, progressive app development, any sort of cross-platform development that's not native, you'll realize that if you have an iPhone device and you're developing an iPhone device, your app's going to look amazing on iOS, right? You're going to be like, wow, this looks just like an iOS app. But then you give it to an Android user, and then the Android user's like, why is the list view flinging like that, right? Why is there a rubber band effect and stuff? Why are there weird highlights? Why is it not acting like an Android app? Even though the user can't get his mind across exactly what's happening there, they'll realize that there's something off about this app, and vice versa. And so natural is the idea that when you write your code runs like an iOS app and like an Android app. So on iOS, it's going to do the list view animations. It's going to, the user will be able to swipe his finger from left to right and actually page the view controller, and then on Android, he'll be able to press back, right? And so that's where the idea of natural comes from. So I'm going to start doing some live coding, just a quick hello world and show you exactly how this works. So to set it up, it uses IntelliJ. You can also use, or WebStorm. You can also use VS Code, and a bunch of other editors. So you can even go crazy and use Vim if you want. I don't know why you would. All right, so I'm going to create a new project here. If anyone's familiar with Android development, it's going to be very similar. It's the project name, project location, description, project type, organization. Again, if you're an Android developer or even an iOS developer, this is the package name, right? And then what's interesting is they ask what type of Android language and what iOS language. We'll get into why they ask this at the end. And so I'm just going to choose Java and Objective-C. That's fine. I'm going to call this com.devfest. All right, I'm going to hit finish. Oh no, lowercase. Whatever, I spelled that so wrong. Okay. All right, so it's going to create. Now, I think this might take a minute, only because of my whole crazy nightmare last night, and it's using my 3G to download the first project's template. But after that, it's instant. So while that happens, let me talk about. Oh, there we go. That was fast. Never mind. Cool. Okay, so yes. It is configured. Don't lie to me. 1 second. Where is preferences? That's why. Okay. Oof. All right, there we go. All right, typically you wouldn't have to do this. Just forgot where my Flutter was. Okay, great. So let's not worry about the code right now. Let's just worry about running this and see what happens. So I'm going to run this on iOS simulator, because if I ran this on an Android emulator, we'll be here till like lunch. It's true. It's true. iOS at least boots up in like 10 seconds. There we go. Look at that. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to run this. And it's something interesting is going to happen here. If you were to look at the debug console, which is missing here, but if you were to look at the debug, oh no, there's right there. Okay, so it's actually running Xcode build. This is really cool, right? It's not running just a web view or anything. It's actually taking all your Flutter code and running it through Xcode build. And there's an Xcode project hidden inside this project. It's not really hidden, it's right there. There's an iOS folder and an Android folder. You can actually open up Android Studio or Xcode and open up these projects and modify them, right? And that's what you typically have to do when you're installing stuff like external third-party plugins, like Firebase or whatever, Facebook login, anything. And so now Xcode build is done, syncing files device to iPhone. Boom. Here's a Flutter app, right? So this is cool, whatever. This is all native, and it runs fine in the emulator. If you actually stuck your phone into the laptop, it'll run really nice. Not that it's not running nice here. Now, this is what's one of the really cool things about Flutter is, let's assume I'm an Android developer, right? And my designer comes up to me, and the designer's like, hey, Faisal, why'd you use blue? Our company's logo is, branding color is green. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. And so the designer's standing right beside me, and I'll be like, okay, let me go change the color. And so what I'll do is I will go here, and I'll be like, okay, green. Now, in a real-world scenario without Flutter, designer would stand there. I would hit run, and on Android, we'd be just looking at each other till Gradle build runs, and then it deploys, and then my app, my phone boots up, and then ADB runs the APK install, and all sorts of crazy stuff, right? In the Flutter world, we're going to do this. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hit save. And what's going to do is, boom, the app is green now, right? And Flutter has this idea of hot reload. So as I develop, the application's changing in real time like magic. to the left of me. And so this enables for a really fast development cycle where you can write really large apps and not have to keep syncing your phone over and over again. Hot reload fails once in a while where you've made like a completely UI change, like you just got rid of entire UI and pasted a whole new UI in. That's because it's like forgetting about the whole internal tree structure it has. But other than that, you'll probably won't ever run into issues with hot reload. So let me give you an example. Now the designer goes to me and says, all right, well, you spelled the text wrong. It's not supposed to say you have pushed this button. It's supposed to say you have pressed this button. So I'm going to say, okay, pressed. Save. It says press now. Now here's what's interesting. If you notice, number 33 hasn't changed. It's remembering the state of the variables, right? So this is very interesting. Yeah, you might say, well, Android has this instant activity reload. Yeah, but it forgets my entire variable state, right? What if I'm like 10 levels deep into an app right now and I need to make a change? I don't want to relog in and do all sorts of stuff again. Here I can do that. I can actually change even the algorithm. So right now when you press the button, it calls this function called increment counter. And by the way, as you're reading this, you might notice that the code is very readable, and that's just because Dart is very, very simple to learn. It's just a boring language, right? And so I'm going to click increment counter, and here, counter plus plus. So when I press this, it's counter plus plus. Well, I'm going to change this to counter equals counter times 2. Save. I've actually changed the algorithm, what that button does. Now I'm going to hit plus, and the algorithms change instantly, right? This is really, really fast. So if you notice, I haven't booted my app, I haven't done anything. All I'm doing is pressing save. Let's add some UI components here, right? And so this is a new text. Let's add a new button here. It's called a raise button on press. I'm not going to make it do anything. I'm just going to get some text here. Child, I'm going to add a text to it. Hello, DevFestDC. Okay, I'm about to press save. Get ready. Look at that, right? Whole new component. And then I can, might as well. Let's go crazy here. Set state. I'm gonna get that button to do something to the counter too. Why not? Counter is equal to counter plus 1. All right. Now it should be whatever that number is, 6-1. Boom. Right? So you can imagine how powerful this is when you're building an app. If this was an Android or even iOS coding session, we'd be refreshing, and I'd be explaining and killing time between those builds, but I don't have to kill time anymore. So this is what's neat. And now I think we can move on. Then we'll get to another demo. So let's go to I don't use PowerPoint. Okay, because I didn't install Keynote. All right, so at an overview, this is the Flutter architecture diagram that I use, and maybe it's slightly been updated because of Cupertino widgets, but let's forget about those. So we got the framework here. You got material, which is the underlying overarching UI design language. That's not stopping you from going crazy and designing your own custom thing, and anyone who has Android phones here? All right, well, I'll get everyone to install a Flutter app that's live on the Play Store. It's not my app. It's just some random app that I found that's gone like a radical design. It's not necessarily pretty, but I just want to say that you can go crazy with Flutter. And then you have the widgets, and widgets are what drive Flutter. Widgets are composable and immutable. That's a whole long discussion that I won't get into about the immutable part, but they're composable, which means that if you saw what I was doing there, I put a button, and inside the button I put a text, right? And the button took a child. A child is a type of widget. So technically, inside a button, I can put anything that's a widget, right? If I were to be crazy, I can stick a list view inside a button. Would that work? I don't know. Probably the touch view would be all crazy, but it's possible, right? So that opens up the playing field to a lot of composable widgets that you can build. And that's why if you go to the Flutter pub, which I'll show, there's lots of interesting widgets being done that will take a long time, very complicated to do on Android and iOS, but very easy to do on Flutter because of this composable nature. Then you have the rendering engine, and that's the whole Skia thing that I was talking about. Actually, Skia's down there. It's just rendering it. Then animation, painting, gestures. You have these nice gestures built into the framework, and so you can have on touch, on tap, on swipe, on drag, and gesture recognizers is itself a widget. So that's also interesting, right? So I can actually take a button, I can add a gesture recognizer in it, and add in something else that it does. So you can get really complicated. Like, I think that's a terrible example, but you can get pretty complicated there. And then you have services. And services are the second most important part of Flutter. And services are all about making your app interact with native code. So why do you still need native code? Well, Flutter's entire idea is not to have everything Android or iOS does, right? You know, tomorrow iOS can come out with like a voice sensor to detect, to do a login instead of face login, right? Flutter's not going to build a plugin for that. Someone on the iOS world will build a plugin and you'll just interact with Flutter, or you can just build a plugin yourself. And I'll talk about plugins right after this. And then you have the native framework, which is all C++ stuff that gets compiled, Skia, the engine, Dart VM, Mojo. I don't even know what Mojo is, to be honest. Anyway, so why Flutter? It's a tight integrated development environment. It's one code base targeting both platforms. It's faster platform iterations, bug fixes, and more. So you can imagine that as you're doing, if you find a bug in your iOS app, unless it's a very weird, specific iOS Flutter bug, chances are that bug exists on Android, and you can just fix it all at once. So if Android user reports a bug, you can fix it on iOS. It fixes everywhere, right? And it's easy to talk to native platforms if needed. I'm going to talk about that right now. So, spoke about that. Okay, so does Flutter support X? Flutter does not support GPS or any crazy hardware sensors. That's not Flutter's idea. What Flutter does is has this really nice event bus mechanism where you can send out an event in your app saying, hey, what's the GPS? And then the Android SDK and whatever code you've written in Android actually and whatever code you've written on iOS will capture that event and do something, Android or iOS, that has to do with GPS and send that answer back via an async method. So that's how Flutter gets around trying to build for everything. So if you look at pub right now, and pub is like the NPM of the Flutter world. So pub is where all the repositories are, and the way pub works is just like Android has this idea of NPM, package.json I mean, Flutter has this idea of a Flutter YAML file, right? And if you go into dependencies, you can add dependencies. The default dependencies is like Cupertino icons, so that's all the iOS icons. But if you want, say, a Firebase real-time database, add it to your pub, right? If you want hardware, login, fingerprint sensors, biometric, I mean, add it to pub and it'll work. So, okay, I'm just gonna restart my phone now. Cool. While that happens, any questions? Yes?
Do you have a GitHub account with this stuff on it?
Yeah, I should. Well, I'll share all that after. Yeah. Yes.
Obviously, we're at a GDG event right now, but somebody outside would ask me why Flutter versus React Native.
Great question. It's like I planted you. No, that's a question I always get. So I was expecting someone to ask me that.
You do away with props, right?
Yeah. So here's the big thing. The way React Native works is there's a big company in downtown that called me over about a month ago to talk to me about their experience with React Native and why they're going towards Flutter, because they wanted to ask me if I'm willing to do some contract work with them. No time for that, but I was asking them, why didn't you guys go with React Native? And this was this big company. This company has like 5 million plus downloads on the Play Store. I won't say their name. But the idea was React Native runs a VM on the phone that actually takes your JavaScript in real time and creates a native button out of it, right? So if you go new button, it will actually create an iOS native button and an Android native button. Now here's where the issue starts to happen. What they did was they built a lot of their code, and they all had iOS devices, and they had an Android emulator. And so they built a lot of the code, made sure that it looked fine on Android, made sure it looked fine on iOS. Now, a crazy Samsung user came along and installed their app on their Samsung device, and Samsung adds custom paddings to some of their buttons. And Samsung adds some weird issues to the list views, right? HTC does the same. And so this idea that a native button looks fine everywhere breaks, right? And so that's where Flutter comes in, and Flutter says, you know what, we're going to get rid of all that. We're going to make sure that your app looks pixel perfect on all devices, right? Exactly how it runs on iOS, exactly how it looks on iOS, unless you do iOS specific code, that's how it's going to look on Android, right? And that's the major big difference. Now, performance-wise, I mean, I'm sure you can have terrible performance on Flutter if you write really bad code, and same with React, and really good performance. So I'm not going to get into a performance fight because that's just ongoing forever. Just from a philosophical point of view, that's the difference between Flutter and React, right? And that's where both of them differ. All right, let's see if this works, guys. Any other questions? Yeah, and so Flutter has the, everything that you expect to make sure that your assets look fine on all different devices. They have a whole assets. I think they pretty much copy the way iOS does it: 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, whatever iOS is at now. So you can just put all your assets in that, and they'll properly divide them on Android devices.
So is Dart the name of the framework and Flutter's the name of the SDK?
Dart's the name of the language. So Dart's been around for a while. And this is what's interesting. If you do write Flutter apps, what you could do is separate your UI code in Flutter from your business logic. And then you can actually use Angular Dart, which stays in line with the latest versions of Angular, and actually have that same business logic deployed on the web, right? So I contracted for a Christian music service called Overflow. Has anyone used it? No. Damn. Oh. Anyways, they have a lot of, it's literally Spotify for Christian music. I don't even know there's a market for that. But what they did was the same thing. They have a Flutter app which has all their business logic code separated into one repository in GitHub, and their web app and Flutter app all use that same code. And they even have Flutter running on the server. So there's 3 platforms there, all using the same shared code with the DRM, the playlist management, all the randomization. Whatever we did there, that's all centralized. Now, there's 2 UIs. There's the Flutter UI, and then there's the HTML UI. That will always be there. I don't think Flutter has any plans to be something that's going to target web. I'm going off a tangent here. I asked the product manager. The answer was, you have to deal with a lot of web accessibility now. You have to deal with a lot of keyboard. You have to figure out how to do tabs and highlight all the elements. That's just not a priority for the Flutter team right now. Maybe in 5 years, who knows, right? So anyways, getting back to this is let me make this screen smaller. Okay. This is Dart's version of NPM, and you can find Dart packages for the web or Flutter. So let's go to Flutter. More Flutter packages. All right, so you can see what's here by most relevant. I don't know how that's sorted, but there's Cupertino icons. I guess everyone uses those. And then you have like Flutter Redux, right? So if you're using the Redux pattern, you can install this there. You have cached network image. This is basically like what's Jake Warren's image library, the famous one on Android that everyone uses. Android caching. What is it? Pardon? No, the other one, not Glide. Picasso, of course, how could I forget? Yeah, so this is like Flutter's version of Picasso, right? And it's actually very easy to do because something that we haven't talked about, and I'll show a demo, is that Flutter doesn't need to do recycling when you're doing list views and any of that. The way the Flutter rendering engine is built, you can just pass in a bunch of widgets, and as they get added, you can keep passing it to it, and Flutter handles all the recycling and optimization for you. And so you don't really need Picasso-style library. All this framework is doing is just caching the image locally. If you actually want to use a web view in a Flutter app, you can install the Flutter Web View plugin. SQLite, it works on core data and SQLite on Android. So there's a lot of Flutter plugins out there already. And if there isn't any, then feel free to write them or add an issue for it. And if a lot of people like that issue, then the Flutter team will go and help. I'm going to show another demo, then I'm going to tell you guys a Flutter hack. So this is a really, I just wanted to show this demo. I saw this the other day. It's an Instagram-like UI. Someone open sourced this. And I want to show you that how detailed your layouts can get. So let's open this. All right, iPhone's already running. I'm going to hit run on this. It's going to do Xcode build again. All right. Okay, and the images should load in a second. All right. So Instagram-like UI. There's obviously spacing issues and stuff, but you can go pretty cool with Flutter, right? There's no limitation. There's not like, I can't tell you that there's a single layout that, oh, you won't be able to do that in Flutter. So this person created an Instagram UI in Flutter, which is pretty cool, and it's all open source. You can actually search on GitHub Instagram UI clone, very specific, and you'll be able to find this code and you'll be able to modify it. And again, here's the complicated layout. Let me show you how thing works, hot reload. So I'm going to do icons. I'm going to change the icon to 80B. Perfect. Let's do that. All right, icon to 80B. And this is going to change something. So let's see what it changes. Save. There, at the bottom, right here. Right? It changed the end to the 80B icon. So a very complicated layout handles it fine. There's no issue with that. All right, so for all the Android developers or Android phone users out here, you can install an app called Crypto Shadow, and it is actually a cryptocurrency tracking app built in Flutter. And for those that don't want to, I'm just going to show a demo of it right here. So let's open up Crypto Shadow. All right, this is built in Flutter. Not the prettiest UI, right? But this developer customized the UI to his or her liking and actually made it very custom. This isn't really material design, other than that floating action button that you see, and there's a lot of nice animation. So I'm going to click on price of Bitcoin, and if you're actually installing on your phone, you'll see that there's a nice animation there, and I hope that translates well. Oh yeah, I think it is, right? And then there's graphs. It's not the prettiest graphs, but developer got graphing working, right? So, and the performance is, if I were to tell you this is just an Android app or it's just an iOS app, it's indistinguishable from like from a traditional Android or iOS app, right? They're both native, so I'm not going to say from a native Android app, but just the way you traditionally code an Android or iOS app. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, are they targeting at all their desktop apps?
No, not yet. I don't think that's a priority right now. What's interesting is that at WWDC, Apple said that they're going to be able to run iOS apps on desktop, right, in 2019. And so technically, they're getting it for free, right? They're not doing any work. Apple's doing their work for them. So you can just write a Flutter app, deploy it, and it'll run on a desktop. So, the future's now.
How do you run it on the desktop? What was the trick?
There isn't, in 2019 we'll know, but Apple has a whole guideline on how they're going to be able to deploy iOS apps on a Mac, right?
Oh, the iOS 12 thing?
Yeah, iOS 12 or something. Yeah,
Some trick.
something. It'll happen. Yes.
Talk a little bit about shortcomings.
Okay, so shortcomings, yes. And I think there's a slide on that. There are no shortcomings. Okay, no, I don't have a slide. So there's some shortcomings. It is, number one, it's just a learning thing. It's not like Android or iOS where, if you notice when I was coding, I had this idea of a set state, right? And the whole Flutter pattern is built on this reactive pattern. So if you've done React or if you've done any sort of reactive development, it's going to come very easily, right? Personally, for me, I had to get my mind across it. Like, I have no idea what was happening the first time. I was like, this is insanity. I don't understand why I can't just set a variable to a button, right? But you have to have set state because it's the way the framework works. You got to propagate. Lots of good documentation on it. And for Android, iOS, or React developers. The other shortcoming is it's beta. It's meant for production apps as of beta 2. Okay. As of beta 2. However, there's still some things that I personally don't like. So Android iOS has this idea of localization, which is great. So you can just have a strings XML file or an NS localized file. On Flutter, there isn't anything like that yet. Flutter supports localization, but you really got to build this file yourself. Performance-wise, it's great. However, it doesn't work on, Android Go devices, I believe, which are like 4.0. There's a certain level of compatibility that Flutter has. So most North American phones will run fine, but if you're targeting for very low-powered phones that are running on just like, 256 megabytes of data, RAM, Flutter's probably not your best bet, right? Whoa, this is just a bad day for me. So there's some shortcomings there, right? Other than that, I don't really see crazy amounts of shortcomings. Just some here and there, you might find a plugin that you don't like. You need but you don't find, or you can just write it yourself, right? So I wrote the in-app purchase plugin for Android. Someone did it for iOS. I'm getting told I have like 4 minutes. So I want to tell you guys a hack. Even if this is recorded, this is fine. So the Flutter team is extremely nice, like the most nicest people alive. And I'm not just saying that because I'm giving a talk on Flutter. This is what happens. A friend of mine who's also writing a music app, I don't know why I have these friends, tells me, hey, Faisal, how do we do a relative layout in Flutter? And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. Ask Stack Overflow. And so he asked Stack Overflow, relative layout in Flutter. All right. And so this is his question. What is the equivalent of relative layout in Flutter? And he says, hey guys, blah, 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 this is my app on iOS, and I want to build a Flutter app so then he can just do iOS and Android at once. And so someone from the Flutter team gets back to him and says, okay, Flutter layouts are usually built on columns, blah, 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 more paragraphs. And then to answer specific questions, and I'm like, wow, that's a good detailed question. And then he says, here's a screenshot of the Flutter app. Here's all the code. And just writes all the code. And this is what's interesting. The Flutter team has people dedicated on the team who do rotation, who go on Stack Overflow and really help you. And this isn't just like limited to this one answer. If you really ask a question and are not lazy about it and actually show that this is what you've done and you've tried and stuff, like they tell you in school, the Flutter team will actually help you and go out of your way and actually write and the code for you for that specific UI. So it's very helpful. Now, if you run into a bug, go to GitHub, GitHub/Flutter. Right? And there's a lot of issues, 3,000 whatever, but these aren't actually, a lot of these are bugs. A lot of these are actually people asking for help and saying, Flutter needs a GPS library. How do we do Google Maps in Flutter? How do we do that? And if a lot of votes are given, Flutter team actually goes ahead and builds it, right? Or actually contracts someone in the community to help build it. Right? And so one of these issues was, I need a way to understand, I'm an Android developer, I need a way to understand Flutter. So Flutter team reached out to me, as well as 2 other developers for React and iOS, and all 3 of us wrote the official documentations for Flutter for web developers, Android developers, iOS developers, and React Native developers, right? So this is great. If you're an Android developer, you can go on here, and I'm just promoting this because I wrote this, but you can be like, all right, what is the equivalent of a view in Flutter? How do I do an intent in Flutter? What is a list view in Flutter, right? And the same stuff is there for iOS also. And so the documentation is extremely rich for Flutter. And I think we're running out of time. So hopefully I inspired you to install Flutter. It takes like 5 minutes, on a good connection. And just start coding, right? And I can guarantee you Dart is not the barrier. I know a lot of people go, oh shit, Dart. No, not really, right? The barrier is just putting in like an hour, and I bet you in an hour you'll probably be able to have an app that like presses a button, gets some stuff executing, and making a network call. Super easy. And with that, thank you for attending this talk.